Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Can everyone hear me? If you're having audio issues, please type into your chat window to let us know, and Tina will try to help you solve the problem. My name is Kathleen Sullivan, and I'm a Health and Safety Advisor with Workplace NL. I'll be presenting today's webinar on human factors increasing the risk of slips, trips, and falls as a part of Workplace NL's Fall Prevention Month initiatives. I will let you know ahead of time that we've been experiencing some internet issues here this morning at Workplace NL. So if we drop off or if there's something that happens, if you lose connection, just hang on the line stand by for a little bit, and hopefully we'll be back and up and running as soon as we can. Today's webinar is part of the Health and Safety Learning Series, and the Learning Series is a program that's designed and delivered by staff at Workplace NL to increase the education and awareness of occupational health and safety and return to work in the workplace. The workshops and webinars address the injury priorities and fulfill the strategic mandate of Workplace NL. Just a little slide on Workplace NL. We serve approximately 215,000 workers and 18,000 employers. Workplace NL administers an employer-funded, no-fault workers' compensation system that promotes healthy and safe workplaces, provides return-to-work programs, and offers compensation to injured workers and their dependents. Prevention Services, which is the department that I work in, is made up of a group of health and safety professionals that focus on promoting OHS education and awareness with employers and workers in our province. So some of the services that we provide include working with employers with high claims costs to help them reduce injuries at their workplaces, provide statistics on employer performance and other measures of safety, develop OHS resources, publications, and workshops and webinars, such as this one for workplaces, develop training standards, approve training programs for certification, and certify people who meet those standards, assisting OHS committees, worker health and safety representatives, and designates to increase the effectiveness of their duties, and provide direction to employers for the prevention of occupational disease and musculoskeletal injuries. A few housekeeping items before we really begin. So in the handout section, you'll find a PDF copy of the presentation that you can download during the webinar. I will let you know that this is only available during the webinar. So if you don't download it, then you'll miss out on the presentation. So make sure that you click on it and download it and then save a copy to your computer or print it off so that you get a copy for yourself. Asking questions is encouraged. If you'd like to ask me a question, you can type it into your chat window, usually on the right-hand side of your screen there, and I'll respond at the end of the presentation. If we run out of time, which I don't think we will today, I'll answer your questions in an email afterwards. At the end of the webinar, you'll receive an evaluation, and I encourage you to complete the evaluation as it helps us develop better and more meaningful webinars. You can include any topics of interest that you'd like to see us present a webinar on, or potentially do a presentation at your workplace. Every 30 minutes, we'll take a micro break. A micro break is just a 1 to 2 minute break to get up, get the blood flowing, do some stretches so that we don't put ourselves at risk for an MSI. So I'll just ask you to stand and stretch and give your body the opportunity to change postures and get the blood moving. All right, so it's not only unsafe conditions that can cause workplace slips, trips, and falls. Human factors can play a major role in the occurrence of these incidents and therefore must be considered when analyzing the potential for workplace hazards. Throughout this webinar, we'll define slips, trips, and falls, explore the factors that lead to falls, including human factors, which is, again, what the bulk of this webinar is about. We'll discuss the role of workplace parties, and then review some fall prevention control measures to help reduce the risk of slips, trips, and falls in the workplace. Slips, trips, and falls are a leading cause of workplace injuries in Newfoundland and Labrador. Over 42,000 workers are injured each year due to falls across Canada, and that makes up about 18% of all lost time claims accepted by workers' compensation boards in the country. 66% of those falls, or 2/3, happen on the same level and are caused by slips and trips. So obviously this is really important, and that's why we're bringing this webinar here to you today. So slips happen when there's a loss of footing due to incomplete contact between the foot and the ground, or from loss of traction between the foot and the walking surface. So as you can see in the picture there, there's a loss of traction between the foot and the walking surface, so he slips and falls backwards. Slips can be caused by slippery surfaces, such as frost, snow, ice, any sort of spill, waxed floors, mud or wet surfaces, unanchored mats, poor lighting, some personal factors of workers, which we're going to touch on in a little bit, environmental factors, as well as improper footwear. A trip, on the other hand, happens when walking is interrupted by an obstruction or an accidental error in stride. So the accidental error in stride would be when you hear people say, I tripped over my own feet, sort of thing, as opposed there's actually something in their way that they might have tripped over. And trips can be caused by uneven surfaces. This could be a wrinkled rug or a carpet, uneven ground, slopes, stairs, and steps. Any object that's in the way. This could be materials, tools, or just general clutter, uncovered cables or hoses, a low drawer that got left open, as well as narrow or short steps, which you see a lot of here in St. John's. Obstructions blocking the line of vision. Poor lighting can cause trips, as well those personal factors and those environmental factors that we're going to talk on in a little bit. And trips can also be caused by improper footwear. And finally, falls. Excuse me. And finally, we have falls. So falls happen when a loss of balance, and it usually does occur from a slip or a trip, results in the body impacting the ground or the floor. So there's two major types of fall accidents. Falls from height, so when a worker falls from an elevation or a ladder or whatnot to the level below, and then falls to the same level, and that would be when they fall to the same level that they were standing on. And the second type, the falls to the same level, are generally caused by slips, trips, and falls, or sorry, slips and trips, and they're going to be the focus of this webinar here today. So there's, again, several ways that a worker can fall in the workplace and injure themselves, or there's several causes of falls. So it could be falling off the side or the edge of a building if you're doing roof work, using ladders and scaffolds the wrong way, using them on unstable ground, or you're overreaching or it's improperly set up, falling through a floor opening, falling off an object like a chair or a stool. I mean, we've all stood on a chair to change a light bulb or to reach something up high, and we might not have used the proper tool for the job. Jumping from one level to another, climbing on material that's not intended to be climbed on or not secured, wearing improper footwear can cause a fall, and then again, finally, as a result of a slip or a trip. And again, those will be the ones that we're focusing on for this webinar here today. So the consequences of falls is also something that we need to consider. So injuries can occur whether you fall from heights, such as falling from a ladder, or if you incur a slip or a trip at ground level. So most people consider slip and trip injuries to be minor in nature, and they don't think that they can result in permanent or serious injury. However, sometimes even slip and trip incidents can produce serious consequences. Injuries resulting from slips, trips, and falls can range from a sprained muscle to a bump on the head to a more serious injury, including broken bones, severe brain damage, paralysis, or even fatality. So again, the whole point of this webinar that we're bringing to you here today is to show that slips, trips, and falls, those falls to the same level, while most people think that they're minor, there are or can be major consequences. So we're going to talk about the risk factors for falls here in the next few slides. All right, so now we're going to look at those risk factors that we've talked about. So I've broken them up into two categories here. And so we have the physical factors, which includes the environmental risks, so such as your work environment and weather conditions, as well as workplace and or work task factors, which include those physical factors in the workplace, such as like the floor and how your work is conducted. So we're going to go a little bit more into detail on these things in a few minutes here. And those physical factors are kind of the things that we see as more of a traditional safety hazard. So like, it's that puddle on the floor, or that's that cord in the walkway sort of thing. Those might be seen as those traditional safety factors. The second category is we're calling it human factors, or I'm calling it human factors, I should say. We've broken that down into two other risk factors. So the first one is biological factors. So those are things like age, gender, your physical condition and physical abilities. And then those behavioral risk factors. So those could be things like being distracted, being in a rush, or being tired. So we're going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail, starting off with the physical factors first. So when we look at our physical factors, again, we have our workplace or work task risk factors. So these are things that are in our general workplace. So there's 8 things here, and this is not a be-all end-all list. It's a general list of some issues that have caused falls, or have I'll say a history of causing falls. So the first one is the flooring. So the composition of the floor. So what is it made out of? Is it marble? Is it concrete? Is it wood? Is it carpet? And then the condition of that floor. So does it have, etching or coating or slip strips, to enhance friction? Is the carpet worn? Is the concrete crumbling? Does it have cracks or pits or dips that have been identified? So those sort of things are things we need to consider when we talk about floor composition and condition. And not only that, so if we do find that this is a factor in falls in our workplace, we need to make sure that they're addressed. The second one is foreign substance potential. And that sounds kind of strange when you say it out loud, but it means is there a potential to have dust, debris, oil, water, wood shavings, or remnants of food from food processing or kitchen waste build up on the floor and cause a hazard. So this time of year, we also, like I said, turn our attention to snow and ice removal, but even leaves can be very slippery on surfaces and can cause a slip or trip. So again, we want to make sure that our walkway is clear of leaves, of snow, of ice. And then on top of that, when we do use our salt or whatever ice melting chemicals we have, to melt the snow or melt the ice, we need to make sure that those are cleaned up as well so that they don't cause a trip hazard, because sometimes you get a big chunk of salt or something like that and you're tripping over that too. So we need to make sure that we're keeping those walkways clear of all obstacles. The third one that is surface or level changes. So this could be the walking surface. So changes in the type of surface. So if you're going from carpet to wood flooring, or you're going from, marble to concrete, or concrete to outdoors even. So the changing in the type of surface actually has a high potential for slips and trips, similar to changes in height or the level of the surface. So if a walker is aware of a transition, so if they know that there's a step there, or if they know that we're going from carpet to hardwood, then they can they can avoid a slip or a trip by adjusting their pace or their stride to transition safely from one surface to the next. And level changes as little as a 1/4 inch, which is really not that large when you think about it, they can cause a possibility of a trip and potentially resulting in a fall and injury as well. The next one is housekeeping. This is a super generic factor, and I'm not going to talk too much about it today because Kim has an excellent webinar tomorrow on housekeeping and 5S. So I'll get you all to make sure you sign in for that tomorrow as well. So poor housekeeping or poor storage, it can increase the risk of tripping hazards, and it can also prevent adequate cleaning and things being put away in the proper place. So if you don't have enough storage, or you don't have proper storage, you end up with things in the way, things in a stairwell, things in the walkway sort of thing that aren't put away, and they can again cause a tripping hazard. Visibility and lighting is the next one. So this can be caused obviously by low light conditions, or even glare, or changes in light, transitioning from light to dark or whatnot. So that affects our depth perception and as well our visual acuity, so how well we can see. Obviously it's lesser in lower light, and that transition and glare can also play a factor. So we need to make sure we have adequate lighting in order to be able to see our tasks as well as see where we're walking. Stairs, 70% of all stair-related incidents occur on the top 3 and the bottom 3 steps. So that's a pretty large amount of incidents that occur on those stairs. So that's only 6 stairs. So many buildings in our province are older. Walking surfaces may not meet current building codes. I think of restaurants downtown. If you've ever been to downtown St. John restaurant, almost every single one has got stairs going from the kitchen to the restaurant part, the eating area sort of thing. So we got people going up and down those stairs on a regular basis, carrying food, carrying drinks, all those sorts of things. So those people are at risk, obviously, of slipping and tripping as well. In some of these older buildings, the steps are sometimes either irregular in height or irregular in depth, which makes trips even more likely. So that's a very large workplace risk factor as well. Number 7 is unusual features. And again, that might sound a little bit strange, but what I'm talking about here are features like sloping. So like if you have a slope on your outdoor area, or you're, going from the garage to the parking lot or something like that, it increases the risk of slips, trips, and falls. And corner cutting. So this is I have this on my own lawn, because when I leave my front porch, I decide to walk across the lawn because it's 3 steps instead of going on the paved part, which is, probably 7 steps to get to my car, or walk the dog or whatnot sort of thing. So these unmarked paths that are created from corner cutting can get muddy, they can get slippery, and again, cause the risk of balance loss, and especially if those things are also on a slope. So then you're doubling your risk. And especially if they get contaminated with mud or water or other matter sort of thing. So again, if you're outside, there's leaves, there's mud, whatnot, it can really really increase that level of risk. So what we should be doing is by changing those slopes to a staircase with a handrail in high risk areas, or creating barriers around the walkway so that you can't step over it, you can't go over it, to take those corner cutting methods. So creating those barriers around the appropriate walkway, we can potentially avoid those injuries. And the last one here is job factors. So again, I didn't want to go too much into detail in this because it really depends on the job that you're in and the workplace that you're in. But like those job factors could be like, do you get tight deadlines? Do you have to be constantly rushing around to try and fill an order? Does that rushing cause fatigue or frustration? Is the safety culture low? Do people not clean up after themselves? Is there enough space to perform that job or that task properly and safely? So there's a whole lot of job factors in there. And again, I didn't want to go into too much detail because there's just so many factors that could play into this. But again, if you said yes to any of those questions that I just asked you, then job factors is a risk factor for falls for you. All right, so moving on. So those were again, the first category of the physical factors, which were those workplace and work task risk factors. And now we're going to talk about the environmental ones. So the environmental risk factors are not necessarily the outdoor natural environment that we think of, but it's the environment in which you work. And you're going to notice that some of these are intertwined or related to those workplace risk factors that we talked about too. So like poor housekeeping, for example, those uneven surfaces sort of thing. So all these are kind of related. So for example, I've come up with a couple of scenarios here to kind of give you a better idea of those environmental risk factors for each of them. So for example, for a mail carrier, the community, the outdoor environment is their work environment. So some risk factors that they may come across as far as slips, trips, and falls could be uneven surfaces, snow or ice buildup, pavement or sidewalk cracks or dips or potholes, poor lighting potentially, depending on the time of day. It gets dark really early this time of year, sorry. Potentially unsafe stairways and obstacles blocking their pathway or their sidewalks if you're going up people's houses. So unfortunately, most of these things are things that a mail carrier may not have any control over. So these environmental or workplace risk factors might not be something that they can control over, but they do have control over that behavioral risk factor that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So another example, if you work at home, like many of us did during the pandemic, or maybe still are doing, some environmental risk factors could be loose carpet or rugs. I trip over the rug probably every day. That's why I got rid of my rug, because I kept tripping over it. Cluttered areas or walkways, pets or children. I mean, I probably also trip over my dog at least twice a day, 3 times a day probably. Poor lighting, The light that you have might not be appropriate for the task that you're doing, depending on the job. And then again, slippery floors potentially, or surface changes. So you might go from carpet to hardwood, or from hardwood to tile, or whatnot, sort of thing. And then just in an office building or in a a warehouse or something like that, for our third scenario here, we could see potentially a poorly maintained building, or a poorly designed building, because again, that can also play into those job factors that we talked about. Poorly enforced policies and regulations. That's part of your environment, is having that culture around you for safety and for enforcing those policies and safety regulations. Poor lighting, surface changes or slippery floors, a lack of grab bars or handrails, depending on where you work again, or the improper stair treads. And then again, broken or unsafe equipment, or changes in equipment that may affect the environment that you work in. So some of these may seem like simple fixes, like like the poor housekeeping, and I'll clean it up, sort of thing. So like they seem like simple fixes, and some are. But we're going to talk about the fixes, the control measures in a few more slides. So we'll get to that there before the end of the presentation. All right, so those were our physical risk factors, so the environment and the workplace. And again, you kind of saw in those how they were related as well. So now we're going to get into the human risk factors, the human factors, and we got two types of those. We have biological risk factors and behavioral risk factors. Unfortunately for us, most biological risk factors are related to age, which is something we can't change, unfortunately, and other things that we can't generally change about ourselves. That doesn't matter. That doesn't mean that we can't acknowledge those risk factors and take actions to prevent some of them, or to make ourselves more aware of how we need to do our work because of these risk factors. So I'm not going to go into too much details on these two, because we want to talk more so about the next slide, but I will do a little recap here. So age is the first one. Again, our workforce in general is getting older. Advanced age increases physical vulnerability and can cause balance issues. Falls from the same level, so again, those slips, trips, and falls, are more prominent across all occupations for workers aged 65 and older. So again, some people might be like, oh, we don't have anybody that's 65 years or older, but that doesn't mean you won't, and that doesn't mean that they're not out there. And they're also more likely to result in a fracture or fatality as workers age. Older workers are more likely to exit the labor force through disability as opposed to a voluntary retirement. So that's a pretty big statement right there. Older workers are more likely to exit the labor force through disability because they've been injured at work as opposed to voluntary retirement. So this means that relatively safe jobs for younger age groups can be more hazardous for older workers. So again, age is the big one here, and most of these revolve around age as well. So gender, unfortunately for women, we're more likely to be hospitalized for a fall, and or a fall-related injury, and then older women are at even greater risk. We're talking 65 plus. The next one, balance issues, cognitive impairments. So this could be related to memory loss, anxiety, depression. Generally, as you get older, you're at more risk for a chronic or acute illness. Things like arthritis, osteoporosis, heart disease, diabetes. All those things can contribute to your physical vulnerability and frailty. Chronic conditions can result in physical limitations that affect your mobility, gait, and your balance. And just an interesting statistic for you here as well, over half of Newfoundland and Labrador residents aged 12 years and older, so this is not related to age, have at least one chronic disease. So most people, over half, already have at least one risk factor, which is a chronic disease. And many people live with more than one. So that's a pretty big statistic there as well. If you're taking medication for any of these chronic or acute illnesses, multiple uses of medications can increase the risk of various interactions and potentially side effects. Again, as you age, you have diminished physical fitness generally. You have the loss of balance, loss of coordination, loss of muscle strength and endurance. So all those can affect your physical vulnerability and increase your risk for fall. So again, we want to make sure that we have those people, those older people, as well as everybody, those physical activities that we're doing, going to the gym, playing sports, playing with your kids, running around in the yard, all that physical activity reduces your risk of falls, and any activity is helpful, but we want ones that generally focus on strength and balance. Those are the key to reducing the fall risk specifically. In addition to those cognitive impairments, some people may have physical or sensory deficits. So again, the dizziness, the balance, any prior injuries or anything like that can affect how you do your work or how you walk or that sort of thing, reaction time. And then sensory deficits, as we get older, usually our vision starts to go, our hearing starts to go, and those things can increase our physical vulnerability for a fall as well. And they may prevent people from seeing the walking surface clearly or hearing somebody call out to them or whatnot. So it's important to know that not all employees have the same physical abilities. So that's kind of what this slide is more so about, not necessarily, shaming older workers or anything, but everybody has different abilities, and safety personnel and supervisors and employers, they need to keep this in mind as they analyze the potential for workplace hazards. So these are hazards that exist in our workplace that we bring to the workplace every day, but that doesn't mean that they can't be controlled. All right, so we're just gonna go through the next slide and then we'll take a little micro break. So the last slide is on behavioral risk factors. So this is kind of where that human factors that we're gonna end up talking about are gonna come into play here. So these behaviors are actions that you perform or exhibit, and also the way your mental state can contribute to a slip, trip, or fall. So for example, being in a hurry may result in walking too fast or running, which increases your chances of a slip, trip, and fall. Taking shortcuts, not watching where you're going, using your cell phone, carrying materials that obstruct your vision so you can't see in front of you. Those are all common elements that contribute to workplace injuries. So I'll just go through each of these a little bit more in depth, and then we'll take a little micro break here. So the first one, carrying or moving large objects, or the second one, moving too many objects at once. They can obstruct your balance, and if you have too many things in your hands, you might not be able to use a handrail to go up the stairs properly or go down the stairs. And this can also be known as a lazy man's load. So I'm pretty sure everybody's done it. You go to get groceries. This is what always happens to me. Go to get groceries. You got a couple bags of groceries, and you're trying to bring them all into the house at once. And again, this is not a workplace risk factor because it's at my house, but it's the same concept can be applied to workplaces. So, I'm like, okay, well, I got to take all these in at once. So I got my arm loaded up with groceries there. I got trying to get the keys in the door, and I have 3 steps going to my house. I'm not holding onto the handrail. And trying to get the keys in the door, and you're kind of like moving stuff around. Anyways, would have been way easier for myself if I, took half that amount to go at the beginning, held on to the handrail, then I would have had a free hand to use my keys to open the door, sort of thing. So again, we're putting ourselves at risk for a slip, trip, or fall when we're doing what we call the lazy man's load. So carrying too much or carrying large and things that may obstruct our view. Poor housekeeping. So you'll notice that this has been in almost every slide so far, that it's a behavioral risk factor, it's a workplace risk factor, and it's also an environmental risk factor. So this is one that's kind of interrelated. And like I said, Kim is doing an excellent webinar tomorrow on housekeeping and 5S that you guys should all tune in for. So poor housekeeping. So that might be just a personal thing that I bring to the table. I might allow clutter to accumulate in my work area, or I might be like, yeah, I'll clean that later. I know it's there, it's fine, sort of thing. So those are things that I, as a worker or any worker, could bring to the job as well. Using improper cleaning methods. So again, this could be really anything, but incorrectly using wax or polish, putting too much on, causes a really slippery floor. Or trying to clean up a grease spill with water, like that's really not the best way to do it and cause very slippery conditions. Not paying attention to your surroundings or not using signage when slips or trips hazards exist. So that not paying attention, it could be looking at your phone, it could be talking and not watching where you're going, any sort of distraction. You might even just be kind of thinking about your own thoughts and in a trance and not really paying attention. So all of that can contribute to slips, trips, and falls. Taking shortcuts, so not using what did I call them? Corner cutters that I talked about before. So not using the walkways or designated paths, not ensuring that cleared paths are available. Next one, being in a hurry or rushing around. So an employee might feel that they need to rush around to keep up with job demands, or that might lead to stress and frustration. This could also be a workplace or environmental risk factor as well. That could be a environment that we're in that might be like, come on guys, we got to get this out the door, we got to do this sort of thing. So that could be an external risk factor as well. Doing too many things at once, so called dual tasking or multitasking. So performing tasks simultaneously demands a higher degree of attention, balancing skills, and executive function than doing a single task at one time. So do one thing at a time, get it done, move on to the next thing. So risk tolerance. So I actually have an extra slide about risk tolerance in a few minutes here because it's actually such a large risk factor. So risk-taking behavior, risk tolerance is different for every person. So some people might think that something is safe when it's not, and some other people might be like, no, that's not safe. You hear that all the time. But risk-taking behaviors, improper use of improper use of devices, climbing, the way you clear snow, anything like that can all put you at risk for slip, trip, and fall, for example. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. A couple other quick ones that aren't on the slide there. So wearing the proper footwear, that's a behavior that we can change, that we can address. If you take multiple medications, if you have an inadequate diet or physical activity, or you do a lot of alcohol or drugs, that can cause impaired judgment, dizziness. Again, could be combined factors as well, sort of thing. And again, although these are behavioral risk factors, as I said, sometimes the risk or the pressure to perform them may be related to external risk factors as well. So it might not just be an internal one. All right, so as I said, I kind of talked about the physical factors and those human factors. Now, however, oh, geez, sorry. So what really is a human factor? So these things human factors can play a major role in workplace slips, trips, and falls, but what is it exactly? So when we think of those human factors, we generally consider those risk factors that I've discussed in the previous two slides, the risk factors that workers bring to the job, those internal almost risk factors, those biological risk factors such as age, health, and physical condition, and those behavioral factors such as rushing or frustration or not paying attention to what you're doing. However, we really want to consider what human factors are. We actually have to think about three things. We have to think about the job, the individual, and the organization, and how those things interact to impact people's health and safety related behavior and the risk for slips, trips, and falls. So again, it's not just about what the individual brings, it's about how that individual acts in that environment and with that workplace and doing that job, sort of thing. We're going to talk about this here in a second. So, for example, so the presence of a slipping hazard is not necessarily enough to cause an incident on its own. So just because there's a puddle of water on the floor doesn't necessarily mean that someone will trip. And just because there's that's that physical hazard. And to control that physical hazard, we have put a caution wet floor sign there. But also just because there's a wet floor sign there doesn't mean that somebody won't slip in that puddle. So the puddle and the sign there, it also requires an employee to take their eyes and their mind off the task at hand by looking at this paper or whatever this guy's doing in order to slip or trip and fall. But also, just because they're reading and walking doesn't mean they'll slip and fall either. So it's kind of like a give and take relationship here. So just because there's a hazard doesn't mean workers will fall, and just because there's a sign doesn't mean they're safe. That's why we really need to consider those human factors to increase personal safety skills and risk awareness so we can lead to fewer injuries. So this slide kind of illustrates why considering human factors are so important. So this is from a study from 2014, actually, in the UK, and it was titled Understanding How Human Factors Affect Slips, Trips, and Falls. And they found that the top 3 factors causing slips, trips, and falls were human factors at 54%, wet or slippery surfaces at 25%, and housekeeping issues at 16%. So in total, of all the falls that they studied, which was thousands in 2014 in the UK, those 3 things, housekeeping, wet or slippery surfaces, and human factors, accounted for 95% of falls. That is a huge number of falls. So the main characteristic that the three biggest causes have in common is that they can be the result of errors in judgment that people make every day, like how tidy to keep their work area, whether to report a wet surface, how fast to walk, whether to go blindly around a corner. And people tend to perceive these causes, especially those human factors, as being a lot less risky than they actually are, which makes it challenging to find effective solutions to control those risk factors. Because these factors require constant attention, they can be avoided entirely or made worse by the employee's mental state or anybody's mental state throughout the day. So what I mean by that is, most safety programs focus on physical hazards, like I've already said, and that should be your first priority, but you can't eliminate slips, trips, and falls by only dealing with those factors. Again, the slips, trips, and falls can be made or caused or made worse by the person's state of mind that they're in. So those states of mind, so a couple of them are listed there on the top of the screen there. We have rushing, frustration, fatigue, and complacency. So those are all either state of minds or behaviors that a worker or we'll say a work environment exhibits. And these states of mind can influence critical decisions, such as wearing appropriate footwear, a response to hazard, whether to report it or not, holding a handrail, and housekeeping habits. And they can cause critical errors, such as getting distracted, walking faster than is safe, losing your balance, and having your eyes or mind not on task. So just because you're rushing, again, doesn't necessarily mean that an injury is going to happen or that a fall is going to happen. Because you're rushing, you might be walking faster than is safe, which can influence your decision making. So you might be like, okay, I gotta go fast, so I don't have enough time to clean up that spill. So again, you're just increasing the level of risk with those things. Doesn't necessarily mean it will happen. It just means you're increasing the chance of risk and the level of risk and the chance of injury. Addressing those human factors starts with an understanding of risk. So again, what you're doing and the risk of the slip, trips, and falls and how they interact. So for example, very few people believe that walking poses a risk of injury, probably because the average person takes thousands and thousands of steps a day very safely. But when we start rushing, like I said, or we're frustrated or tired, the risk of slipping or tripping increases, but our comfort level of walking still stays the same. So we don't anticipate falling because we safely take so many steps a day, or we don't anticipate the risk of slips or trips because we safely take so many steps a day. But the chance or the level of risk actually increases when we're in these states of mind or when we bring these behaviors to the job. So before we're able to reduce those slips and falls, we actually need to realize how risky those behaviors are and what our risk tolerance is for those behaviors. So this slide's on risk tolerance. So everybody in the world, it doesn't matter what your experiences are, what your training is, or that sort of thing, everybody has a different level of risk tolerance, which makes it really difficult for employers, especially, to create that awareness in their workplace. So many employers conduct those checks and inspections of their workplaces to identify those slips, trips, and falls, but either slips, trips, and falls are risks are not identified because they're not perceived as being a risk. So again, walking is a risk. I know it sounds crazy, but walking can cause injury. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that employers, supervisors, workers, everybody has clear, simple information on what constitutes a slip and trip hazard. So again, slip or trip hazard could be a spill on the floor, an uneven floor, a raised carpet edge, an uneven floor tile, or an unsecured mat. Any object left in a walkway, any object not stored properly or put away, leaks from equipment or the roof or the water cooler or what have you, recently cleaned or wet floors, rainwater or snow brought inside on soles of people's shoes, snow or ice buildup, using the stairs while carrying objects, and rushing around while using those stairs, sort of thing. So what we need to do as employers and as supervisors in the workplace is we need to make sure that we change that risk tolerance, that level of risk perception in the workplace. So some things that we could do, these are just very basic examples, would be to play videos or share stories about the impact of slips, trips, and falls, provide statistics. Some people are numbers people, so providing statistics about the dangers and the potential severity of slips, trips, and falls. And then not only that, like the thing to really get it to hit home is ask them how much an injury would limit them. So whether at work, at home, with their family, in any sports or hobbies that they do. I like to play sports in my free time. So if I get injured at work from a slip or a trip, then that's going to really affect my social life and my active life because that's something that I like to do in my free time, for example. So when you really think about it, if you do get injured, that you're affecting every aspect of your life, not just your work life. So that's why that level of risk tolerance and changing that perception of risk and lowering that risk tolerance is really important. All right, so again, risk tolerance can be affected by a lot of things. So this slide is just a general thing that we need to consider when we're talking about human factors, what we bring to the job, what we really need to ask ourselves. What do we do? What do we think? What do we perceive that may contribute to the risk of slips, trips, and falls? And these are all kind of related to risk tolerance as well. So your personality, do I ignore instructions? Do I take risks? Am I like, okay, yeah, I'll get that done, but I'm going to do it my own way, and I'm going to do it however I feel like it should be done, sort of thing. Fatigue, when you're tired, you act or perceive risks differently than when you are alert. So fatigue can affect your risk tolerance. Behavior, again, do you rush around? Do you take shortcuts? If you're doing those things, if you're exhibiting those behaviors, your risk tolerance is low, or sorry, you have a lower risk tolerance, you're putting yourself at more risk. Perception, how do you absorb information out of your environment? So I might be like, oh yeah, there's a puddle of water on the floor, but I can still walk over it. Or yeah, well, I know that there's a cord in the walkway, so it won't affect me, sort of thing. So those things are perception, like how do I perceive my work environment? Capability, do you carry out tasks beyond your capabilities? Again, that's related to doing more than one thing at the same time, carrying a load that's too heavy or too awkward or you can't see in front of. All those things are the capability that you bring to the workplace and that you carry out tasks beyond those capabilities that you have. And then the last one is related to communication. So how do you communicate or comprehend that risk? So if, like I said, if I saw a puddle of water on the floor, I need to communicate that to somebody, probably my supervisor, or I clean it up or whatnot, but I need to be reporting that. And so I communicate that risk so that everyone else is aware and has that same level of perception of risk from that hazard. Okay, so getting back into, or getting out of, I guess I'll say, the risk factors and getting more into what we need to do as part of our safety program. So our safety, slips, trips, and falls are a complex problem, and we need a complete plan to effectively fight them and include solutions for both physical and human factors, the ones we've already talked about here. So many safety programs already do a good job of reducing slipping and tripping hazards and providing rules and procedures for cleaning and maintenance. Again, controlling those physical safety hazards, those traditional safety hazards that we've talked about. But as we've discovered, people are influenced by their state of mind and behaviors, and someone only needs to get distracted once or sidestep the rules and slip and fall and get seriously hurt. So as an employer, you need to address both those physical factors as well as giving your employees the safety skills that reduce their chance of slipping, tripping, and falling. So again, those wet floor signs, they're important, but they don't work if people aren't paying attention. And rules about housekeeping are great, but they're no good if people are in a rush and forget to follow them or say, I'll clean that up later because I'm going to lunch or whatnot. We need to incorporate human factors into training to encourage employees to take a personal responsibility and build safety habits, combine them with the company's responsibility for those physical factors, and we can reduce the frequency of slips, trips, and falls. So who's responsible for preventing slips, trips, and falls? You can't force employees to pay attention, but you can help them understand how their mental state affects their safety. And that's kind of what we're talking about here, how that mental state, how their risk tolerance, how those behaviors affect their health and safety at work. And you can empower these employees to take personal responsibility by giving them the skills, awareness, and habits they need through training. So again, we need to work together and have the company take responsibility for the things on the left-hand side of the screen there, and the workers, as well as supervisors and employers as well, take that personal responsibility to reduce those slips, trips, and falls in the workplace. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about each workplace party's responsibilities here in a couple of minutes, or over the next few slides, sorry. So as an employer, the things that we really need to do are to identify people's roles and responsibilities. So we don't have people going beyond their capabilities or doing things they're not supposed to that cause slips, trips, and falls. They should be doing risk assessments to identify those hazards and informing workers and supervisors of them. So when we do a risk assessment, we need to take into account the facility design, the work area that people are in, the equipment or tools that they use, the materials and processes that they use, the task characteristics, and looking at all those things and looking at how they affect the health and safety of workers when it comes to slips, trips, and falls. The other things that might be considered is shift work. That may cause, because people may be more tired on night shift because it's not their normal time that they're awake. And as well, the people need to be taken into account as well, like not just the behaviors, but those individuals. So again, if you have older workforce, maybe you need to put in some more controls to make that job safer for that person as part of that risk assessment. Employers also need to investigate all incidents and near misses. We need them to track and trend, identify areas of concern. So this can be done with what's called site mapping or plotting. So if you have like a little design of your facility and you say, okay, all the slips, trips, and falls are happening at the front entrance. What do we need to do at the front entrance to make that safer for our employees? We need to make sure that controls are put in place as soon as possible, or temporary measures if there's a delay for whatever reason. And reviewing those hazard reports, even hearing what people talk about in the lunchroom, that sort of thing, they will all help you track and trend those incidents and identify those areas of concern. As employers, we need to develop those safe work practices and procedures in fall prevention. We need to provide training to workers in the precautions to take to prevent slips, trips, and falls. So again, this can be those physical things that we talked about, but it can also be those human factors. So, you might be tired on Monday morning, as everyone is, or on Friday afternoon, you're like, I'm in a rush because I want to get out of here. I want to go home to my family for the weekend. So we need to provide that training in those physical factors, as well as in those human factors, to precautions for workers to take to prevent slips, trips, and falls. The other thing we should make sure that we're doing is, if you're doing workplace inspections, as you should be, as required by legislation, we need to add those slips, trips, and falls risk factors to those workplace inspection checklists, making sure that there's not cords in the walkway, or making sure that if there's a maintenance issue with a piece of equipment, it's getting addressed so there's not a puddle of water constantly on the floor. All those things need to be added, need to be considered when we're doing those workplace inspections. And again, these are all the employer's responsibility. So the next one is the supervisor's responsibility. So again, they kind of have the in-between responsibility. So they have some employer responsibilities, such as identifying and correcting those slips, trips, and fall hazards when they can, as well as advising workers of those slip, trips, and fall hazards. So they need to be informing workers of these hazards. The safe work practices and procedures that the employer makes up, it's a supervisor's responsibility to enforce them and make sure that employees are in compliance with their footwear policy, or that they're not rushing, or that they're using the handrail, whatever safe work practice procedure you put in place. They should conduct instruction and training sessions on those slips, trips, and falls. And again, those training sessions that were talked about previously, they got to include physical factors as well as human factors in that training. And then they should ensure the work area is free of clutter and walking surfaces in good condition. Just in general, the housekeeping, the general working environment that the people are working in, they should be making sure that those things are, like I said, free of clutter and free of slip and trip hazards. Another interesting thing that I came across when I was doing research for this webinar sort of thing was a quick clean center. So they had included it under the supervisor responsibility. And that's a convenient location with paper towels and absorbent materials and cleaning products, so they can clean small spills. So if you have an area where there's spills constantly, if you're working in a kitchen, for example, everybody spills everything. Well, I spill everything in the kitchen anyways. So having like a quick clean center, so like a convenient location that has everything that you need to clean up a spill and throw it out or put it in the garbage or whatever and move on. So that's a quick clean center is a nice convenient way to have those things available for workers to clean up those spills and reduce the risk of slips, trips, and falls. The next one is the worker responsibilities, of course. So their responsibility is to follow those safe work practices and procedures that were developed and enforced by the employer and enforced by the supervisor. So this could be, again, that footwear policy. It could be to push rather than pull carts so you can see where you're going. It could be whatever safe work practices and procedures are implemented in the workplace. They should be adhering to recommended housekeeping practices. So again, if your housekeeping practice is you clean up your work area before you go to lunch, well, they should be adhering to that. And again, that should be enforced by the supervisor. They should be wearing the appropriate footwear for the task. So if the employer has a footwear policy, or even if they don't have a footwear policy, like if you're not going into a warehouse wearing high heels or something like that, like we need to make sure that we're wearing the appropriate footwear and we're not putting ourselves at risk for a slip, trip, and fall. Identify and report hazards I should say fix unsafe conditions immediately. So we want people to be identifying and reporting those hazards to the supervisor, but we also want them to not walk by a puddle of water or not walk by a cord in the walkway. Fix those conditions and then report it to your supervisor and say, hey, I just did this, just so you're aware. So any spill, make sure you're cleaning it up or making arrangements for it to be cleaned. Any damaged floors or mats, or if you see something on the floor where someone could trip over it or something's not put away properly, make sure you fix that condition immediately and then report it to your supervisor as well. And then the last thing that we should make sure that workers are doing, or the last responsibility that we're going to cover, is participate in those training sessions that are offered by the employer and supervisor and make sure that they know what they need to do to prevent those slips, trips, and falls, what their responsibility is to prevent those slips, trips, and falls. So I've been talking about this a lot and I'm going to keep talking about it. So reminding workers of safe work practices, safe walking and housekeeping practices can be useful, but it doesn't necessarily result in long-term change in habits. So just saying, oh, don't forget to clean that up, or don't forget to clean up your workplace or whatnot, it doesn't necessarily result in long-term changes in habits. It can help that day or that at that time, but it might not result in long-term change. So what we need to be doing to make sure that that's doing is regularly address those human factors in toolbox talks and safety meetings. So anytime there's a change in the working condition or the work process, you need to remind the workers about the risks of human error. So like I said, if you're feeling tired today, if you're doing this, whatever, maybe there's a different job that you can be doing that's less risky, or maybe work with a buddy or that sort of thing. So we need to be addressing those human factors in our toolbox talks and our safety meetings at all times, really. And then we need to really be incorporating those human factors into your training. That will deliver long-term behavioral training, because we need workers to have the skills and the habits that they can use in real time to reduce errors, make better decisions, and maintain focus. So they're less reliant on those constant reminders that you're giving them in those toolbox talks and safety meetings and as you're walking by or whatnot. And again, most companies already have plenty of rules or procedures and engineering solutions to deal with those physical hazards. But implementing the human factors into your training requires a lot more than, again, just telling workers to pay more attention or walk slower. So, when we say those things, we are addressing human factors, but we're not addressing them long term. We're not changing the habits of workers and people in our workplace to address those factors. So adding those human factors to your training is about providing workers with the ability to recognize when they're at risk for a slip or trip incident and adjust their activities in the moment to avoid that injury. It's about complementing and strengthening compliance measures by addressing the mental element. So again, I need to be able, as a worker, I need to be able to recognize when I'm tired or when I'm frustrated or when I'm rushing, and be able to make those changes in real time. Say, okay, I know I'm rushing around. I need to pay better attention to what I'm doing. Or, okay, I have something going on at home. I'm distracted because my phone keeps going off. And I need to realize at the time that I need to be able to make better decisions and maintain my focus. So again, that mental element comes into play in the middle of a busy workday or at the end of a long shift, when workers are more prone to slipping into distraction or inattention. Again, workers then will rely on their personal safety skills. So what we need to do as employers is we need to train workers in, again, those human factors to develop their personal safety skills and empower them to think critically and choose safe behaviors. So that's the key there. Like those behaviors that we exhibit, we're choosing to exhibit most of those behaviors. So we need to choose to adjust our walking speed or stride to whatever those is suitable for the surface or the task that you're doing. We need to think critically and choose to use our 3 points of contact on stairs and ladders. Holding on the handrail when you're going up the stairs, or making sure that when you're on a ladder, you have 3 points of contact. We need to choose to take our time and pay attention to where we're going. We need to choose to make wider turns at corners so we're not running into people, especially at blind corners. I run into people all the time because I'm not choosing to use the bubble that's right there above my head that shows me that there's someone in my path. We need to choose to wear appropriate footwear. We need to choose to avoid sudden pivoting or turns so that we don't run into something or trip over something, or our own feet for that matter. We need to choose to plan ahead, choose the safest path, and make sure you're walking it and identifying that there's any areas of a concern that may cause an incident. We need to choose not to use our cell phone while we're walking or working. And we need to choose to stay, get, or become active and make sure that we maintain those biological characteristics that we need to maintain, that strength and that stability and our balance to make sure that we're not putting ourselves at even more risk for a workplace injury due to a slip, trip, and fall. So again, how do we do that? That is the big question here. So as we've already discussed, when workers are in a rush or when they're in a mental state, it affects their ability to make good decisions. And it's usually compromised, and they're more likely to rely on their habits that they've built up, not necessarily what the safety manual says. So we need to build and strengthen those safe working habits mentioned on the last slide, those things that we're choosing to implement those safe behaviors. We need to build that to be a habit. And we can do that by a continual process of examination and reinforcement. So we need to analyze those mistakes that we're making. We need to adjust our habits so we can choose that new habit or choose that new behavior that we're going to do. We need to practice them. So again, that's that constant reminder coming from those toolbox talks, coming from the training, coming from your supervisor walking by. We need to be practicing those new habits and implementing them. And then as we see those results that we're being successful, we're avoiding slips, trips, and falls, then we are going to be more likely to have them become a habit because we're seeing that we're successful. So once we see that we're successful, it becomes more of a habit, and we're a lot less likely to make those mistakes and choose those unsafe behaviors, and so we can avoid those slips, trips, and falls. So learning habits like this is important, but again, it requires that constant motivation, support, and reinforcement. So as employers, we need to be empowering workers. We need to be saying, we need to be reminding them, we need to be motivating and supporting them in this habits so that they can make sure that they continually choose new things. And that's why it's really important to implement that human factors into your training so people are aware of what happens when you rush and what happens when you're tired or what happens when you're distracted. And that can in turn motivate employees to improve their safety skills. Again, so we have talked about so far, we've talked about what a slip, trip, and fall is. We've talked about what human factors is. We've talked about how those physical and human factors revolve around each other and affect one another, and how they how they affect safety-related behavior. We've talked about how we need to build habits. We need to empower workers to make the choice to choose safe behavior. So now we're going to talk about some controls, and so what we can do about human factors and reducing their effect on those slips, trips, and falls incidents that we talked about. So I've divided up the controls a little bit differently than we would normally see them. So normally we'd see them associated with the hierarchy of controls. But going back to that UK study that we discussed at the beginning of the presentation, where we got those stats from with the 54% of falls being related to human factors, I've kind of presented the control measures in terms of high, medium, and low priorities for us to implement, as opposed to our normal hierarchy. And it's based on those statistics that they provided and the amount of injuries that they the amount of injuries that they studied and the causes that they had determined were related to those injuries. So again, they determined all the causes of the injuries that they looked at, and then we've broken them down into high priority controls, medium priority, and low priority controls. So, with the falls with the most common underlying causes, or those root causes that we're talking about, the slips, trips, and falls that they investigated. These were the reasons that they happened. So the first the first control measure is to ensure that all workplace parties are aware of their health and safety responsibilities. This seems like such a basic thing, but so many people are not aware of what they need to be doing or what is their responsibility, especially when it comes to health and safety. They might know their job, but they don't know their health and safety responsibilities. So we need to make sure that everyone knows that. Providing workers with that regular health and safety training, including identifying and reducing slips and trips risks. What we really need to do as employers is we need to customize that training around the actual work situation, and not only raise awareness, but also help create ownership and help make staff aware of how to deal with that slip or trip hazard about that job or in that job. And regular refresher training should also take place. It shouldn't just be like something that they do when they get there on orientation. It should be something that gets refreshed on a regular basis. So doing and incorporating human factors into that training. So, this job is, has periods of peak demand where we might be rushing to get work out. Well, we need to take more caution when we're in this situation, or that sort of thing. Showing staff pictures and photos of their work environment and asking them to identify those slips, trips, and risks can also help them be a practical way of assessing risk in their own workplace. And they can also be tested on what action they can take to see if it lines up with the priorities or the procedures that the workplace has in place as well. Another thing we need to do is make sure an effective maintenance and housekeeping program is in place. So maintenance is super important. The amount of times that you have a lot of safety, especially with slips, trips, and falls, a lot of safety related things are actually maintenance related risks. So ensuring proper maintenance and effective maintenance and timely maintenance of equipment and materials and facilities is really important. And again, that housekeeping program that we're going to talk about, Kim is doing an excellent webinar on it tomorrow, which you guys should all log in for, on housekeeping in 5S. And it's about a housekeeping program that you can put into place in your workplace. The next one, conducting regular checks of workplaces to identify those slip and trip risks and implement controls immediately. So again, if you're doing those regular checks of your workplaces, those workplace inspections that everyone needs to be doing anyways, we need to add those slips and trips risks, to those work inspections to make sure that they're covered and that controls are put into place immediately. And then the last one there, display those warning and caution signs. Just because they're there doesn't mean somebody won't trip, but it does help to regularly communicate those hazards to workers and what measures are in place to control them. So again, we need to be making sure that we're communicating that information, and we're also communicating the control measures that are put into place. So as you can see, a lot of this is about awareness and education and training. That's what's going to help us implement those, control those human factors when it comes to slips, trips, and falls. Those medium priority control measures. So these were kind of like the middle chunk of causes of incidents in that study that I was talking about there in 2014. So the medium amount, or they were kind of like that middle chunk of causes. So provide recognition for good safety behavior. So again, that might seem like something that's really simple, but if you see an employee cleaning up a spill, or you see them putting something away where it's supposed to be, or showing good housekeeping, that's something that is good safety behavior. We want to recognize them so we can reinforce that habit so they'll continue to do it, and we won't be putting people at risk for slips, trips, and falls. We need to encourage workers to report and deal with those slip and trip hazards. So a lot of times when there's a slip hazard or trip hazard or whatnot, people ignore them. People don't realize that they're a risk. So we need to encourage workers, if they see something, to report it. We need to involve workers in generating controls for slips and trips hazards. So again, a lot of employers say, oh yeah, well, we'll just do this. And that might be good, we'll say, in a time management perspective, saying, yes, you got something in place, but is that effective? Is that what's going to help the worker? Is that actually going to make the work more difficult for the worker? Are they going to have to take more steps, whatnot, sort of thing? So we need to make sure workers are involved in generating those controls and they have input into the discussion. We need to investigate all those slip and trip instances to find the root cause. So again, being more careful is not a root cause, or telling someone to be more careful. That's not a corrective action that will actually stop it from happening again. So we need to use those findings to identify appropriate control measures to prevent that reoccurrence, to prevent that from happening again. And then on top of that, if we implement control measures, we need to investigate the effectiveness of those control measures as well. So again, does it make it more difficult for the worker to do their work? Are they adding an extra step? Do they need to change what they're doing because they're wearing more PPE or whatnot, sort of thing? We need to make sure that those control measures are effective. Review and provide feedback on incidents at staff meetings. So again, this is not saying, oh, well, Billy went and got hurt on the floor the other day, so we need to make sure we're talking about slips and trips. No, that's not really what that's about. It's about more like, okay, guys, so we've had a number of incidents at the front desk, people slipping or tripping over the mat when we come in. And these are the things that we have done to implement, or we've done to control it. And hopefully, if we're telling you and we're making you aware of it, it will reduce the risk of slips and trips as well. We need to make sure workers are supervised and those health and safety rules and those safe work practices and procedures are enforced. If people aren't wearing the appropriate PPE or aren't wearing the appropriate footwear, or they aren't cleaning up their work area, like what are we doing to make sure that those rules are enforced? We want people to have consequences for those things to make sure that those are not acceptable things to be doing. And then the last one there for the medium priority control measures is consider slip and trip hazards during the procurement process. So when we're getting new equipment, so for example, we need to pilot that equipment to avoid purchasing a mat, which doesn't absorb enough water that's going to be used around the dishwasher or in the kitchen or something like that. We need to make sure that they don't, again, produce a new hazard that puts us at higher risk actually of slipping or tripping. So again, those are things that we need to control in the medium priority. So this is kind of the first priority is the education, the awareness that we need to bring that to our workers. The medium priority is more like those controls that we're putting in place and making sure that those controls are effective. And then those low priority control measures, so it's just like a small number of those slips and trips and falls that were investigated in that first study that I talked about there. So this was the cause of only a few. So ensure that workers are provided with the adequate cleaning materials and that spills are cleaned up immediately. So those quick clean centers that I was talking about, that's a great way to make sure that there's adequate cleaning materials available, and that if it's right there, right in front of them, they're more likely to go do it, as opposed to if they gotta, oh, I gotta walk all the way to the other side of the building to get a paper towel or something like that. Again, storing the cleaning materials close to where spills occur, right there. Those quick clean centers is a great thing to implement there. Ensuring workers wear the appropriate footwear for their work environment. So if you work in a kitchen or you work in a restaurant or that sort of thing, and the floors are slippery, or there's, whatever food waste or whatnot on the floor, maybe that's something you need to look at is, do we have a footwear policy and are workers following it? And then the last one is ensure the floor surface or finish is adequate for the environment. So again, this is like a low priority because it's unlikely that we're going to replace the whole floor or that we're going to do something along those lines. It might be the appropriate measure, but we need to make sure that the finish or the floor surface is adequate for the environment that we're working in. We don't want a slippery tile in a kitchen, or we don't want a slippery tile in a bathroom for that matter. We need to make sure that whatever we're doing is adequate for the environment, the work environment that we're working in. All right, that brings us to the end of our presentation, or the end of the material, I guess, here, guys. So just a quick recap. If you're only addressing the physical causes of slips, trips, and falls, those physical risk factors, then you're only dealing with half the problem. Again, those wet floor signs and hazard warning systems don't work if employees are distracted and fail to notice them or heed their warning. If you don't address the human factors associated with slips, trips, and falls, injuries will continue to happen no matter what other measures you take. All workplace parties, employers, supervisors, and workers all have a role to play in dealing with slips, trips, and falls. And the last point there, it is possible to train workers to develop personal safety skills and be more aware of where and how they're moving. Again, this takes constant motivation, support, and implementation. Those things that I was talking about, and those building those habits, and we can create those habits to be safe so they choose those safe behaviors more often. And if we do that, we can reduce the number of fall incidences as well as foster a strong safety culture instill personal responsibility, and adjust people's perception of risk. So again, that risk tolerance, that what do people perceive as being risky, we can adjust that by working those human factors into training and developing those personal safety skills. So just a quick note, I guess I'll say, November is actually Fall Prevention Month, and this is a Canadian initiative, and this webinar is part of Workplace NL's Fall Prevention Month campaign. So Fall Prevention Month is a Canadian campaign that encourages organizations and individuals to come together to coordinate fall prevention efforts for a larger impact. We all have a role to play in preventing slips, trips, and falls. Here at Workplace NL, our efforts are obviously focused at fall prevention in the workplace. But again, Fall Prevention Month isn't just about the workplace, it's about at home, in your community, as well as at work. You can visit Workplace NL's website, www.workplacenl.ca, to access resources or raise awareness of fall prevention in your workplace and to take part in education and activities to prevent workplace falls throughout the month of November. So you can visit our website for more information, as well as for the link onto the Fall Prevention Month website. Another little tidbit of information here is that we at Workplace NL have a new Ohs Legislation App. So this app was developed by Workplace NL in partnership with Digital Government and Service NL as part of the government of Newfoundland and Labrador. So it's an app that accesses the Ohs legislation for Newfoundland and Labrador. So when connected through Wi-Fi, you can access selected websites through quick links and receive update notifications. And when you're browsing off the app, you can still search and browse the Ohs regulation and related materials. You can copy and paste content. You can email parts of the Ohs regulations and related materials to somebody at work or your safety person or workers or whatever. And you can also submit feedback to us about the app. And your feedback is super important to us. And if you have any questions or concerns, especially about the Ohs guide or legislation app, you can email us at info@workplacenl.ca. All right, upcoming webinar. So as I've already mentioned several times, Kim is doing a webinar tomorrow on housekeeping and 5S. So again, that's also super important. That's also a offering for our Fall Prevention Month. And then on November 18th, which is Thursday, Jane is looking at the hierarchy of fall protection. So again, that's more so for working at height, but also related if that is something that you do in your workplace. On November 22nd, we have a pre-recorded version of the new first aid kits for workplace, and that is the CSA standard Z1220-17. So that is a pre-recorded version, but it's also available on our website. November 24th, there's a webinar with Cheryl about evaluating the MSI risks. So that's musculoskeletal injuries, and talking about tools to help people evaluate the risk for musculoskeletal injuries. And then on November 25th, we also have preventing hand injuries, which obviously is about preventing hand injuries. And that'll be on the 25th. And all these webinars take place from 10 to 11:30, unless they're otherwise indicated. I believe all these ones are from 10 to 11:30 on those days. But for a complete listing of our webinars, and you can visit our website at workplacenl.ca, and I think that Tina has put the link in your chat box as well, in case you want to use it that way. So to receive updated information on prevention services, free workshop and webinar offerings, you can head to our website, www.workplacenl.ca. You can scroll to the bottom of the main page and click View All Events. So it's just circled there on the screen for you. And then once you click, from there, you can subscribe to receive emails with upcoming events. So don't miss out, subscribe today. And again, Tina has put that link into your chat box there, so you can click right on there and you can sign up for a full list of our webinars and our newsletter. So again, their feedback is important to us. You will receive a feedback survey at the end of, or evaluation, sorry, at the end of the webinar, when the webinar closes. And you can please take the time to complete your evaluation. It really does help us offer more meaningful and valuable webinars for you. And that's what we're here for. So thank you very much.